Hi, I'm Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of Mighty Blaze, and I'm excited to be here today and honored to be here with Meghan Perry, who's going to talk about her book, Water Finds a Way, and she's actually agreed to read a little bit from it as well. So a few housekeeping details before I talk about Meghan and her book. I've put in the chat we at Mighty Blaze love independent bookstores, and we want you to buy all your books from them for you, for the community, and just because it's a great thing to do. So to help you, I put up a link to bookshop.org. If you click on it, it'll give you an indie bookstore nearest you, or you can order online from a bookstore. If you have any questions for Meghan, pop them in the chat. We love questions, even if it's just to say hi, Meghan. That's like fine too. So let's talk about, first let me tell you about Meghan. Meghan Perry grew up in New England. She began her career in education, teaching high school English in New Jersey. She's published short stories in Sycamore Review, Cold Mountain Review, Passages North, Prism Review, Permafrost, and The Fourth River. After relocating to Massachusetts, she received the opportunity to design and direct a writing center at an independent secondary school on the North Shore of Boston. It's at St. John's Prep. We were just talking about that before she got on, which I think is incredible. So Water Finds a Way is an incredibly, I called it a fiercely original novel, which it is. It's about a young woman who gets out of prison, and Thomas Wolfe always says you can't go home again. Well, in this case, she goes home, and it's Maine, and she finds it's now kind of a derelict community determined to stay afloat, and she becomes friendly with the local lobstermen. It's, the novel is just penetrating. It asks all sorts of interesting questions. Where do we find our families? Can we be forgiven? This is one of my favorite questions. And how place impacts who we are. Kirkus gave her a star, and Kirkus never gives stars, and said it's full of grit and atmosphere, suspense and feeling, a powerful and promising debut. Publishers Weekly raved, Perry crafts the action with a cinematic scope. Readers will find plenty to enjoy in this poignant tale. This was also recommended on Newsday, Condé Nast Traveler, and bookclub.com. And it's just a really terrific, wonderful book. So thank you, Meghan, for being here. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to show off your book here. So my first question is, I'm always interested in how writers write what they write and how they're obsessed with whatever they're obsessed with. Can you tell us, this is a first novel, even after you've written stories. So my first question on that, this is like a 6-parter, but I'll just break it up, is what was the origin story of this? What made you, did this start as a short story, and did you think, oh, this needs to be a novel? Or did you think, oh, I'm going to try to write a novel? And what was it about Maine and lobster people, which are certainly interesting things to read about, that grabbed you?
This book actually is quite an origin story, Caroline. It began many, many years ago. First of all, in terms of where I start with writing, I always start with setting. Setting is my primary place. And then from there, I grow my characters and I grow my plot. And for me, Maine inhabits my soul. My family dates back to Maine many, many generations. And as a kid, I grew up spending a lot of time in the summer in southern Maine, and my parents, to distract and keep the children distracted, would take us down to the local lobster fishing pier, and we would watch the lobstermen come in from their morning catch and unload, the lobsters in these big crates, and you'd smell that bait smell and the diesel fumes, and so all of that was very familiar to me from a young age. And Maine is a big state, and there are multiple Maines. Southern Maine is so different from down east, which is so different from the northern interior. And down east was a place I'd had the opportunity to visit multiple times, and it haunted me in the fact that it's so beautiful, but it suffers.
It is beautiful.
It's gorgeous. And most people think of these really picturesque rocky shores and, piney islands. And, there's a story behind all of that too, though. As with many rural communities, a lot of these fishing communities in down east are plagued with issues like, the opioid crisis and lack of access.
Right.
And that story, the unseen story, always intrigued me. So anyway, jumping ahead, when I went through MFA, I had written a short story that was set in this fictional town of Raker Harbor. I just kind of cooked that one up. And it sat with me. And then when I went on, I began teaching in New Jersey. I started writing short stories for literary magazines. And I wrote a trio of stories that was set in Raker Harbor, Maine. And the editors of these journals were coming back to me and saying, this is really great. Like, do you have anything else? And I was in the middle of like my first.
That's wonderful.
Time, and I'm going, I don't have anything. I can't write that. But I'm like, all right, I need to come back and write a novel about this. So anyway, it was a long time before I was able to find the time to focus on writing a novel. And then I spent many years trying to write a different novel. The protagonist of that different novel that was set in Maine was the young lobsterman who is currently Leland Squard. And this was totally different plot. It had him getting involved with his nefarious cousin and drug smuggling and all kinds of things. And I worked so hard on this thing. I wrote probably 1,000 pages at least of draft, and it just was not working. I was tearing my hair out. And finally, in 2021, I said I had lost patience with everything, as I think many people in the world had in the middle of the pandemic. And I said, I'm not going to work on this anymore. I need to start fresh. And the current protagonist of Water Finds a Way, her name is Blake Alvarez. She had been a very, very minor character in that other novel.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting. I love that.
And when I brought her forward, I'm like, maybe let me look at this through her lens and see what happens. And immediately, this character ran off with the narrative. She took it over. Everything just kind of poured out, and reimagining through her lens allowed me to reimagine all these other characters that had kind of been floating in my head. It was so liberating. I killed some off. I changed the genders of others. I, brought others back to life, and they all worked together just so organically. It was, I keep telling people, it's the closest thing to magic I've really ever experienced as a person, as a human, let alone as an author.
That's extraordinary. And that does sometimes you do realize you have the wrong point of view, or you're dealing with the wrong character and it's just not working. But that's a really interesting thing to know, because she's just full blown on the page. I mean, she's breathing on the page. So I wanted to know about, like you mentioned, I don't know if it was on your blog or in an interview, that you had a lot of training as a short story writer. How were you terrified to take on a novel? Did you know how to write a novel, how to structure it? Did you take a class? Did you read books? Did you just fumble your way through? How did you do it?
Well, I've always been a reader, but I have to tell you, when you go through MFA, at least the MFA program I had at Emerson, they focus a lot on writing short stories. They want you to really master that form, which is so important to be able to do that. But I was a very reluctant short story writer. It took me a while, because in my head, my stories were always so much bigger. And I remember actually way back in high school, I had won some writing contest and went down to Miami to meet with some professional writers. It's all the winners from across the country were brought together, and you met one-on-one with these folks who kind of mentored you for a week. And I remember one of the writers I was paired up with told me, "You're not a short story writer, you're a novel writer." And I was when I was 17, and I was like, yes, so right, because I was really more comfortable with a longer form, but of course had really no idea how to do it. And years of laboring on that other novel that never happened really taught me that it's a lot harder than it looks. But I knew I had a bigger narrative inside. And like I said, shifting those things around and having that strong lead character just kind of brought all the threads together for me, and enabled me to write something that was paced correctly and that had such kind of emotional resonance.
But how do you write? Did you write a synopsis out first, or any kind of outline, or did you plaster Post-its all over your walls, or did you just sort of fly by the seat of your pants?
I got a little superstitious because before I'd always been an outliner and a planner. And with this one, I kid you not, like I didn't even name the document. It was just document 4. I didn't put a title on it. I'm like, nope, I'm going to curse myself.
Wow.
I just kind of wrote forward on this one, and I had a little notebook next to me, and I would jot down ideas of things I knew I wanted to have happen. And then each day at the end of the day, I might like reorder those to like, okay, maybe it should go in this order. But beyond that, I really kept my hands off of outlining and planning. And I also did something that I always tell students to do, which is, you know, go ahead and make the mess first, then
Right.
go back and worry about cleaning it up.
Right.
I'm a hypocrite because my inner editor is so loud and tyrannical and ruins so much of what we do. And this time I just told her to shut up. And because I was able to do that, finally, I was able to write this thing. And I wrote the draft of Water in under 2 months, which is lightning speed. I'll probably never write anything.
That's incredible.
But it was also during the pandemic, so there was a lot less life happening in the background as well. And I'd already done all the research into the community and the issues that I wanted to write about. That I think that's why it came so quickly.
And so what did you do in terms of revision? Did you show it to other people, or did you just go back through it? Did you read it out loud? What did you do?
When I finished it, I really, I'd written this for myself to just kind of prove that I could write a novel instead of write half a novel over and over again. And when I finished it, I was really kind of scared to show it to anybody. And I only showed it to a few people. I printed it off and mailed it off to these folks. And they just raved about it. And I was like, okay, well, maybe we can take this to the next step. They're like, oh, you got to find an agent. You got to get this published.
Oh, that's hard.
I had no idea how to do any of that. It had been a long time since I'd been an MFA and had talked about those kind of things. And of course, the world had changed so much since then.
Right.
And, here I am, middle tail end of the pandemic, whatever you want to call it. And I think a lot of other people decided during the pandemic they were going to write a novel too. So I'm jumping into this frenzy to find an agent and find a home for this thing. And it was really very, very overwhelming. There was a huge learning curve involved in that. And I'm just so fortunate that things worked out the way they did.
That's great. I love hearing that. So I want to talk a little bit more about, the Thomas Wolfe quote where he says, you can't go home again, but she does go back home. But I was curious that she returns to a small town, which usually small towns are very gossipy. And at first she can hide her secrets. But I was wondering, what is it about Maine and Maine society and community that allows her to be able to do that?
Well, I think, that was her adopted home because her original home was in Lowell, Massachusetts, and she'd had a very traumatic early life. And so at 17, she flees to the home of her grandparents up in this Maine town. And she really only, I won't give spoilers, but she only really lives with them for a short period of time and things happen. And then she leaves them. But during that time that she spends there, it really does become her first true home. But I think during the time that she spent with her grandparents, she was very protected and kind of very isolated. And her story wasn't necessarily known. So when she's coming back all these years later, no one really knows who she is. They know the name of her grandfather.
Right.
Kind of an infamous character there, but they don't know her. And she's very much an outsider. She looks very much like an outsider and she acts very much like an outsider. So she's treated as a total outsider and really has to start from the ground up in terms of, she wants a job on a lobster boat. Good luck. You're a strange woman moving into this town with these, it is very close knit. And these fishermen are looking at her and going, lady, we ain't hiring you. The only one desperate enough to do it is the guy who's struggling the most in the town, who's a total alcoholic, dysfunctional. So,
Did you go on a lobster boat yourself? Have you been lobstering?
I've been out on a lobster boat tour, which was totally touristy. But they teach you they teach you about how they do it. But I really got my research through their surprising number of books written about lobster fishing and eating lobster in Maine and the lobster culture. And it's really very fascinating.
Lobster culture. What's the most fascinating thing about lobster culture? I love that.
It's really like, I was unaware that, like, there's territoriality and all of that, and there are different zones for lobster fishing, and there are different quotas, and there are always rules and regulations changing, and that puts, economic pressure on lobster
Right.
fishing, and it just, there's so much more involved in it. While the act itself of catching lobsters has been pretty much the same for a long period of time,
Mhm.
I think all the political climate, the social climate, everything that has changed over time. And I was really fascinated by this idea of like territories on the water, and like, ooh, if you set your traps too close to another guy, then you're going to get like a knot in your line, or you're going to be just sliced off completely. And like, kind of the fallout from that can be quite dramatic.
Yeah, I love that. I love books where you learn stuff that I just didn't know. So I want to talk about the ocean. I mean, I personally am totally fascinated by the ocean and also terrified by it because it's so big and there's all these creatures in it. But I wanted to know why, if you could talk about why the sea is so redemptive for your characters and for you.
For me, it's funny. We had a place, like I said, in southern Maine that we would go to every year. And I remember taking a walk on the beach with my dad when I was a little girl. And we got talking about God and whether God existed. And
Wow.
for my dad saying, if God exists, he'd live right here. And he pointed out to the ocean. And that has always stuck with me because I'm not a super religious person, but there is something about the ocean, right? That's just so much bigger than us. And you're right. It's also very terrifying. There is nothing more powerful on this earth really than water in its enormity.
That's true. That's true.
For Blake, because her grandfather had been a lobsterman, she found her place on the water with him in this it was just Blake and her grandfather going out every day fishing for lobsters. And I think she found her peace there. And that memory of that peace is what draws her back to this place because she craves it so badly at that point in her life.
Yeah, it's overpowering. It's overpowering. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the time and place. There's such a strong sense of a specific time, a specific place. How difficult was that to sustain? Did you make charts or lists? Did you have photos by your desk to, keep that going?
I'm somebody, when I visit a place, and I visited down east quite a bit by the point that I was writing this book. But when I go to a place, I'm like a sponge. I sit and I just absorb everything about it. And like the essence, the aura of it gets inside me. So to be honest with you, I think maybe the pandemic brought out a little bit of nostalgia because you couldn't go.
Right.
Inside, and I was, locked in suburban Massachusetts when I was writing this. And I longed for it. And I think it was that hunger that like made the memories even more visceral and even more alive for me. So it was there right next to me as I was writing the whole time.
I wanted to ask you, do you personally think we can ever really outrun our past, or do we just have to make friends with it instead?
I think we have to find our peace with it. I don't know if we make friends with it ever, but I think you don't outrun it ever.
Yeah, I think so too. Okay, I wanted to talk about this gorgeous cover. I hope everybody can see it. Covers are notoriously either really super right or super wrong. I wanted to know, was this cover the way you imagined it? Did you get to have input on the cover? How did it come about?
This cover has actually quite a story. You probably didn't know that when you asked the question. So when a book is acquired, obviously you don't have a lot of input usually. Right. And the designer who made the original versions of the cover had gone a direction that it didn't feel like the book. It was very bright. It was, I guess what was very hip and hot on the bookshelves at the time, or even now when you walk into a bookstore, everything's like electric pink and
yeah. That's right.
I looked at that and I said, it's just, I'm not feeling it. And I really kind of went to bat for something different. And finally, one of the editors had this painting hanging in his home, and he took a picture of it and he sent it through. He's like, well, is this what you want? It's like, that is exactly what I want. That right there. And when I saw them mock up the cover, I was just like, oh, That's it. That's the essence.
It's very evocative. It's really, really very evocative. And this would be a great time to remind people that, you can order this. There's a handy link right in the chat, and all you have to do is click on it, and you can order it from an indie bookstore. Let's talk about the title, too, because titles also are, at least for me, my titles are always changed a million times. Was this your original title?
No, this is the third title that this book
has. What were the first two titles?
The first title was Another Ocean, and that was actually titled after a short story that I had written about Ray.
Oh, that's a good title.
And I liked it, but people didn't feel like it expressed enough of what the book was about.
Okay.
And it got changed to the molting season, like lobsters molt their shells. So characters in the book kind of, but I didn't love the word molting.
Molting, yeah, it's kind of.
Neither did the publisher, and so they asked, do you have any other ideas? And this was something that actually my husband and I came up with because, in the book, there's a line from Blake's grandfather when he writes her his final letter saying basically, water always finds its way back to the sea, and hopefully someday you will too. And I thought that's such a great idea because that's literally what Blake is doing. She's finding her way back to a place of stability and peace throughout the novel. And I love the title.
I do too. I think it absolutely fits. I want to ask you about the swear tax, because when I read about that in the book, I said, I love this. This is so delightful. Where did that come from? Is that a real thing?
I've heard of people implementing those for like their children. For me, if it was levied against me, I would be so far in the hole broke at this point. Right? I mean, I have a mouth like a sailor. And so that was a point. It was funny because I actually toned down some of the swearing in the book, and there's still a lot. But it was something that just came to mind. And because the character of Leland just cusses so much, both in French and in English, that I thought it would be funny to have Quinny kind of his daughter.
It was adorable. And, springboarding from that, I want to talk about Leland, the lobster fisherman, and his daughter Quinny, because it would have been delightful enough just to have Leland. I was wondering if you always saw him with a young daughter, or if she sort of came about right on the page.
I didn't. In fact, in the other book I was writing, Leland was a single father, but of an infant son. And I had never planned on bringing a little girl into this. I'm a mom of two boys. I work in an all-boys school, so I know boys really well. Despite being a girl and being raised with a sister, I just don't feel like I know little girls real well. And so that was another thing that just kind of came out from changing the characters. And I thought, oh, how cool that, Blake could kind of look at this little girl who's very precocious and little naughty and really has never had a mother the way that Blake really never had a mother. And that just worked really well. And I think that Leland and Quinny, it's a very interesting dynamic between them since she's had to essentially in the relationship.
Yeah. Great character. I wanted to ask you how you manage your time. You're teaching a writing program in which you created. You're a novelist now, and you also have two boys. How do you manage your time?
I don't. I mean, I wish I could say that I'm really great at managing my time. I try. I think, when you think about managing time, it's more like I have to take my life in seasons. And during the pandemic, my boys were young and young enough that they weren't like feeling super down about the pandemic. It was just kind of like they were in the house and they were doing things. And so I could kind of monitor them from a little bit of a distance because I knew they were safe and my husband was home. But like the pandemic was like my writing time. And then ever since the world is ramped back up again, it's been much more about obviously being present in the school. And then my boys are older and I'm, shuttling them to activities and things like that. So I do very much want to write the next book, but finding the time for that is definitely very much more challenging than it was when I wrote this.
Okay, I have two questions that I ask every writer who comes on here, and then we're going to have the privilege of listening to you read. The first question is, what's obsessing you now and why? Besides the election.
What's obsessing me now, honestly, one of the books that I really want to write is set in South Dakota near the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. It's a place that I had an opportunity to do an extended period of community service in high school. And it's a culture that's always really fascinated me. And I think with the whole like Yellowstone craze and all this Western stuff, I have like a slightly different take in my head of everything. And I really want to explore that.
Cool.
So
That's really cool.
That.
Okay, so my last question before you read is, what do you do for fun?
I run. That may sound sick, but I love running and hiking, and I love just traveling to very off the map places.
I like off the map. I like off the map places too. If something is strange, I want to go there. So, would you do us the honor of reading, like, say, a page and a half from the book?
Sure, I'd be happy.
Great. Thank you so much.
I will read to you from at the beginning of the first chapter. So I'm going to cut out the prologue, but start at the beginning.
Perfect.
Blake left the car on the edge of the road and took the driveway on foot. It was a rutted vestige of a driveway that spelled death to city cars in mud season. The wind carried curls of wood smoke and a pervasive current of salt, and she walked with her head bent against it, hands stuffed in the pockets of her big coat, the black rope of her braid smacking at her back. Patches of late spring snow still clung to the shaded slope where blueberries once grew. A dark fringe of evergreens shivered icy dew as she passed beneath them. The land was familiar still. She remembered the lichen-splotched knuckles of granite that poked up from the hill like a tease to clumsy feet. When she reached the house, a silvered skeleton of a farmhouse with a sagging roof and boarded windows up top, she allowed herself to pause briefly and acknowledge its emptiness. Then she beat her way through a gauntlet of thorns that clawed her coat. Beneath her boots, rusting discs of beer cans broke apart in the weeds. The loiterers and the revelers had all gone. There were only ruins. Her ruins now, her single inheritance. In the rear yard, she found the shell of a rotted-out skiff where her grandmother had once planted marigolds, great buttons of tangerine and gold that bloomed all the way to first frost. She blinked away the memory. The bird bath had toppled and cracked in two. Beside the shed, her grandfather's wooden lobster trap sat decaying like a pile of old rib cages. She passed these relics, her eyes hard and determined, her heart an unrelenting drum. The apple tree stood at the edge of the yard. It was a gnarled relic now, whose tattered limbs still sported a few black shriveled fruits. She knelt beneath it and pressed her fingers to the scarred bark, announcing herself. Then she worked them down to the base of the trunk and searched. Though weeds had engulfed the tiny slate marker, its etched initials had endured 27 winters. She traced them once with a ragged fingernail, then lifted the stone clear, and with her knife commenced to carve at the soil. The job proved difficult, the earth still winter-bound and reluctant there in the shade. She shucked off the coat and blotted sweat from her temples, set her teeth. The urn she found first, a tiny vessel for a tiny purpose. She lifted it out and set it among the slick roots. Her heart shuddered once, then settled. She continued to dig until the blade struck the lockbox. Its weight as she pulled it to her lap reassured her, and when she thumbed the numbers and popped the rusted clasps, she found inside, still wrapped in plastic, the big nickel-plated Smith & Wesson. 6 .357 Magnum rounds popped from the cylinder into her hand. She jangled them like loose change, reloaded them, hoisted the barrel. She pressed it to her cheek until she felt the metal strike her teeth. The wind came softly there below the hill. It washed over her broad shoulders and sighed away across the tidal marsh. She drew slow breaths, her finger bent around the trigger, the damp of the ground bleeding through her jeans. A squirrel skittered through nearby bushes and stopped to peer with its beady eyes. At last, she lit its gun and zipped it inside her coat. Her first test, she had passed.
That's wonderful. That's completely wonderful. Well, I want to thank everybody who was here today. I want to remind you again, please can find Water Finds a Way at your favorite indie, or you can just click on the link I've provided for bookshop.org. Thank you all for asking questions. Thank you all for being here. We'll see you all next week. And thank you particularly, Meghan Perry. I loved having you here, and I love talking about this book, which I also love. See, there's my blurb right there. Okay, so we'll see you all later. Meghan, you just hang on.